The fall of an empire, the birth of a legend. The summer of 476 AD marked a turning point in world history. In Italy, the once mighty Western Roman Empire, which had dominated Europe, North Africa, and the Near East for centuries, was now only a hollow shadow of its former self. After years of internal collapse, political assassinations, and waves of barbarian invasions, the imperial throne was occupied not by a towering Augustus or a brilliant Marcus Aurelius, but by a boy, Romulus Augustulus, barely a teenager. When the Germanic general Odoacer stormed into Ravenna, he executed Romulus' father, Orestes, and deposed the young emperor. Yet rather than slaughtering the boy, Odoacer took pity. Romulus was exiled to a villa in Campania, allowed to live out his days in relative obscurity. Odoacer then sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple robes, the scepter of Rome, to Constantinople, declaring that one emperor was enough. From that moment forward, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. Historians would later mark this year as the fall of Rome. And yet, history is rarely so simple. For centuries after 476, there would be men who stood against chaos, men who fought to preserve Roman order, Roman law, and Roman civilization. Some were generals who commanded battered legions against overwhelming odds. Others were philosophers, popes, and emperors in Constantinople who still considered themselves Romans in every sense. The question arises, was Romulus Augustulus truly the last Roman? Or does that title belong to another, one of the brave, desperate figures who carried the Roman torch long after the West had fallen? This is the story of the last Romans, a journey stretching nearly 1,000 years beyond the supposed end of Rome. Valentinian I, the last emperor of the Rhine. To understand the beginning of Rome's final decline, we must travel back nearly a century before Romulus Augustulus, back to the mid-4th century, when the empire still appeared strong, but cracks had already begun to spread beneath the surface. In 364 AD, after years of turmoil and civil war, a new emperor rose to the purple, Valentinian I. He was no aristocrat born in Rome's marble halls, but a hardened soldier, a career officer from the frontier provinces. His father had served the empire faithfully, and Valentinian himself had spent decades fighting along its borders, where danger was constant and survival depended not on rhetoric, but on steel. Valentinian proved to be a capable and ruthless ruler. Recognizing that the empire was simply too vast for one man to govern, he divided power, naming his brother Valens as emperor of the East while he himself ruled the West. It was a pragmatic solution, a recognition of reality. For Rome no longer projected effortless dominance across the Mediterranean. It clung to power by sheer will and by the strength of men like Valentinian. Valentinian's greatest challenge lay along the empire's most dangerous frontier, the Rhine River. For centuries, the Rhine had been Rome's shield against the Germanic tribes beyond. Legions guarded its banks, forts and watchtowers lined its waters, and towns flourished in its protection. But now, in the 4th century, the tribes across the Rhine had grown stronger. Confederations like the Alemanni posed real threats, capable of massing large armies and launching devastating raids into Roman Gaul. Valentinian was determined to confront this menace head-on. Between 367 and 369, he personally led a series of campaigns deep into Germanic territory. He rebuilt abandoned forts, strengthened river defenses, and reasserted Roman presence on lands that had once been held by the legions. In a decisive battle at Solicinium, he faced the Alemanni and their king, Rando. Though the Romans suffered heavy losses, they ultimately crushed their enemy and forced the tribes into submission. It was a bloody, costly campaign, but for a time, Roman authority along the Rhine was restored. This was more than a victory, it was a statement. Valentinian was the last emperor to lead significant campaigns beyond the Rhine, pushing Roman arms into the forests of Germania. Never again would Rome be strong enough to project that kind of power across the river. Within a few decades, the Rhine frontier would collapse entirely, unleashing chaos that the empire could never reverse. Yet for his victories, Valentinian earned a reputation as one of the last emperors to embody Rome's old martial spirit. Even his death carried the stamp of his ferocity. In 375, while negotiating with barbarian envoys on the Danube, Valentinian flew into such a rage at their arrogance that he burst a blood vessel and collapsed, dead from a stroke. The emperor's body failed him, but his vision of Rome as a fortress holding back the barbarian tide lived on. Later, historians would look back at Valentinian I as the last emperor who truly defended the Rhine frontier, a final flash of Roman strength before the flood. He was not yet the last Roman, but in his defiance of the barbarian world beyond Rome's borders, he stood as a precursor, a reminder of what the empire had once been and of how far it would one day fall. Adrianople, the day Rome shattered. In 378 AD, the Roman world faced a crisis unlike any it had seen in centuries. The barbarians, long a nuisance at the empire's borders, were now breaking through in overwhelming numbers. But these were not mere raiding parties of warriors. They were entire nations on the move, men, women, and children with their wagons, livestock, and hopes for survival. They were the Goths, fleeing from a terror that had erupted on the eastern steppes, the Huns. A storm of horsemen, ruthless and relentless, the Huns had smashed into the Gothic homelands north of the Danube. Desperate for safety, the Goths came to the Roman frontier in 376, begging for asylum. They offered loyalty and service in exchange for land within the empire. The emperor in the east, Valens, brother of Valentinian I, agreed. The Goths were allowed to cross the Danube into Roman territory. But in doing so, Valens set a precedent that would change the empire forever. For the first time, a massive foreign people were admitted not as scattered recruits or mercenaries, but as an intact nation, armed and united. The resettlement was disastrously mismanaged. Roman officials exploited the desperate refugees, demanding bribes for food and even selling starving Gothic children into slavery. Hunger and humiliation soon turned into rebellion. What had begun as asylum descended into open war. By 378, the Goths were ravaging the Balkans, burning towns, plundering farms, and defeating every Roman force sent against them. Valens, campaigning in the east against Persia, abandoned his frontier war and marched west to confront the crisis himself. It was a decision that would seal his fate, and the empire's. The march to Adrianople, Valens gathered his army and advanced toward the Gothic horde, which had encamped near the city of Adrianople in modern-day Turkey. He had been promised reinforcements from the Western Empire, where his nephew Gratian ruled. But Gratian was delayed, and Valens faced a choice: wait for help or seize the glory of victory alone. Pride won out. Valens' advisors warned him to wait, but he believed his army was strong enough, and he feared sharing the credit for a great victory. On August 9, 378, the emperor gave the order to attack. The battle. At first, the battle seemed to go in Rome's favor. Roman infantry pressed against the Gothic wagons, where the refugees had taken shelter. But then, like thunder from the horizon, the Gothic cavalry returned. A vast force of mounted warriors swept down on the Roman flanks, hammering into their lines with devastating force. The Romans, trapped in the heat of the day on the open plain, were surrounded. Dust and screams filled the air as the Gothic horsemen cut through legionary formations. Valens himself fought among his men, but it was no use. The Roman army collapsed into chaos. Soldiers threw down their shields and fled, only to be ridden down. Others fought to the last, surrounded and cut apart. By the end of the day, 2/3 of the Roman army lay dead on the field, and the Emperor Valens himself perished. Some said he was struck down by an arrow. Others claimed he was carried, wounded, into a farmhouse that the Goths then set ablaze. His body was never recovered. The consequences. The Battle of Adrianople was one of the worst defeats in Roman history, a disaster compared by later historians to Cannae or Carrhae. But its consequences were even greater. For the first time, a barbarian nation had destroyed a Roman field army and killed an emperor in battle. Worse still, the Goths were not annihilated. They remained inside Roman territory, free to roam and plunder as they pleased. The empire was too weak to expel them. Instead, they were eventually settled within its borders as federati, allies in name but independent in practice. Adrianople shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility. The Rhine and Danube frontiers would never again be secure. More and more tribes would cross into Roman lands, not as scattered mercenaries, but as entire peoples, carving out kingdoms within the empire itself. Historians ever since have looked back on Adrianople as the day the ancient world cracked, the moment when the Western Empire's fate was sealed, even if it would take another century to collapse entirely. And yet, amid the rubble of defeat, Rome still had defenders. From the ashes of Adrianople, new generals would rise. Some would betray their empire. Others would fight to their last breath to preserve it. One of them, a man of mixed heritage, half Roman and half barbarian, would soon become known as the last of the Romans. His name was Flavius Stilicho. Flavius Stilicho, the half-barbarian who saved Rome. The smoke of Adrianople had barely cleared before the Roman world began to look for saviors. With the Emperor Valens dead and Gothic war bands still roaming free inside the empire, the East turned to a seasoned general named Theodosius. This soldier from Spain was recalled from retirement, crowned emperor in Constantinople, and tasked with restoring order. It was under Theodosius I, later known as Theodosius the Great, that one of the most remarkable figures in Roman history first rose to prominence. His name was Flavius Stilicho, a man of two worlds. Stilicho's story was unusual. He was not a pure Roman aristocrat, but the son of a Roman mother and a Vandal father who had served in the Roman army. At a time when barbarian blood was often treated with suspicion, Stilicho's mixed heritage could have been a liability. Instead, it became his strength. He embodied both worlds, Roman discipline and barbarian ferocity. From a young age, Stilicho distinguished himself as a soldier, earning the trust of Theodosius himself. In time, he married Serena, the emperor's niece, binding him to the imperial family. This alliance made him more than just a general. It made him a guardian of Rome's destiny. Guardian of the boy emperor. When Theodosius died in 395, the empire was divided between his two young sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. Honorius was only 10 years old. The real power in the Western Empire now fell to Stilicho, appointed as Magister Militum, master of soldiers. It was a poisoned gift. The West was fragile, its resources stretched thin, its armies riddled with Germanic mercenaries of questionable loyalty. The Rhine frontier trembled, Britain was exposed, and in the Balkans, the Gothic leader Alaric had risen to power. It fell to Stilicho to hold the empire together, and for nearly 2 decades, he succeeded, against impossible odds. Stilicho versus Alaric. In 402, Alaric, leading the Visigoths, invaded Italy itself. It was the first time in centuries that a barbarian army had marched so far into the Roman heartland. Panic spread through the cities of the Po Valley. Yet Stilicho responded with precision and fury. At the Battle of Pollentia, fought on Easter Sunday 402, Stilicho's army clashed with the Goths in a brutal engagement. The Romans fought with desperate courage, and though Alaric survived to fight again, Stilicho had saved Italy from immediate destruction. Later that same year, he struck another blow at Verona, forcing Alaric into retreat. For now, the Eternal City was safe. Stilicho became the living symbol of Rome's resilience, the iron wall holding back the tide. The Rhine invasion. But danger was never far. On New Year's Eve, 406, disaster struck. A massive confederation of Vandals, Suebi, and Alans surged across the frozen Rhine into Gaul. Entire provinces were overwhelmed, cities burned, the Roman West bled. Stilicho tried desperately to respond, but the empire's resources were stretched too thin. He put down rebellions in Britain and Gaul, and even managed to stabilize parts of Hispania. Still, the empire was cracking. Every frontier was under siege, and Stilicho was only one man. The fatal betrayal. For all his victories, Stilicho faced enemies within as dangerous as those without. Many Roman aristocrats despised him for his barbarian blood. They whispered that he was too lenient with the Goths, that he secretly conspired with Alaric. His closeness to the imperial family, his influence over Honorius, these only deepened their resentment. In 408, as Alaric once again threatened Italy, Stilicho prepared for another campaign. But court intrigues sealed his fate. The young emperor Honorius, swayed by jealous ministers, turned on his greatest protector. Stilicho was accused of treason. His troops deserted him. Abandoned and cornered, the half-barbarian savior of Rome surrendered. He was executed without trial. His loyal followers, many of them barbarian auxiliaries, were massacred in the aftermath. The consequences of Stilicho's death. The decision was catastrophic. Within months of Stilicho's death, Alaric returned unopposed, and in 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. Rome was sacked. For the first time in 800 years, the Eternal City was at the mercy of foreign invaders. It was a blow not just to Rome's walls, but to its spirit. The city that had ruled the world was now plundered, its people enslaved, its pride broken. Many historians have argued that Stilicho's execution sealed the empire's doom. Edward Gibbon, in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, would later call Stilicho the last of the Romans, a man who, though born of mixed blood, embodied the courage, strategy, and determination of Rome's finest days. He had stood against the chaos and held it back, if only for a little while. Stilicho's death marked a turning point. After him, the Western Empire slid ever faster toward collapse. And yet, even as the city of Rome itself was plundered, other figures would rise to defend what remained. One of them was another general, a man named Constantius III, who would, for a brief moment, restore stability and win back much of what was lost. Constantius III, the forgotten emperor who saved the West. When Stilicho was executed in 408, the Western Roman Empire spiraled into chaos. The Goths under Alaric marched on Rome itself, and in 410, the Eternal City was sacked for the first time in nearly 8 centuries. Panic spread through the empire. Provinces declared independence. Armies mutinied. Usurpers rose and fell in quick succession. It seemed as though the Western Empire would collapse entirely, and yet, against all odds, a new figure emerged to steady the crumbling state. A general whose name is often forgotten, but whose achievements bought Rome another generation of survival. His name was Flavius Constantius, later known as Constantius III. A soldier from the provinces, Constantius was not born into imperial power. He was a provincial officer, hardened in the ranks, who rose to prominence during the years of crisis. He came from Illyricum, a region famed for producing tough, disciplined soldiers. Many of Rome's greatest generals had come from these rugged lands, and Constantius would prove to be no exception. By the early 410s, after Stilicho's death and Rome's humiliation at the hands of Alaric, Constantius had become one of the Western Empire's leading commanders. Where others fell into despair or betrayal, Constantius remained loyal to Emperor Honorius. It would be his steadfastness that saved the tottering regime. The struggle against the usurpers. The western provinces were fracturing. In Britain, the legions had declared their own emperors, first Marcus, then Gratian, and finally Constantine III. a usurper who crossed into Gaul with his troops and seized control of much of the West. Spain soon followed his banner. For Honorius, besieged in Italy and helpless, this was a disaster. But Constantius was dispatched to deal with the problem. In 411, Constantius confronted Constantine III. Through skillful maneuvering, he trapped the usurper in the city of Arles. After a brutal siege, Constantine surrendered, hoping for clemency. Instead, he was executed. His severed head was sent to Honorius, a grim reminder that rebellion against the emperor would not be tolerated. With Constantine's fall, Constantius had restored Gaul to imperial control. Spain, too, though scarred by war, slowly returned to obedience. Britain, however, would never again be recovered. Its legions had withdrawn, its towns left to fend for themselves. Constantius had saved much, but Rome's grasp was no longer universal. The Gothic problem. Yet the Goths remained. Alaric was dead, but his people were still within Roman territory, led by his successor Atholf. They had plundered Italy, kidnapped imperial princesses, and remained a constant menace. Constantius, however, was a master diplomat as well as a general. He recognized that endless war against the Goths was unsustainable. Instead, he blockaded them, cut off their supplies, and forced them into negotiations. By 416, he had achieved a remarkable settlement. The Goths agreed to become foederati, federated allies of the empire. Athaulf even returned Galla Placidia, Honorius's half-sister, who had been taken captive during the sack of Rome. Constantius married her himself, cementing his bond with the imperial family. From their union was born a son, Valentinian III, who would later rule as one of the last Western emperors. The brief empire of Constantius. Constantius's victories and diplomacy had transformed the Western Empire's fortunes. Gaul and Spain were restored. The Goths were pacified. Italy was stable, at least for the moment. In recognition of his achievements, Honorius raised Constantius to the rank of co-emperor in 421. For a brief instant, it seemed as though Rome might recover, but fate was cruel. After only 7 months as emperor, Constantius fell ill and died. His reign was tragically short, and his name faded into the shadows of history. Yet his legacy endured through his marriage to Galla Placidia and the birth of Valentinian III, who would rule the empire during its final act. The legacy of Constantius III. Though rarely remembered today, Constantius III was the man who pulled the Western Empire back from the brink. At a time when usurpers, barbarians, and chaos threatened to extinguish Rome forever, he restored authority, forged peace, and gave the empire a fleeting revival. His reign proved that even in its darkest hours, Rome could still produce leaders of vision and strength. But his death left a vacuum. The Western Empire would soon fall again into turmoil, racked by internal divisions and fresh invasions. A new storm was brewing, this time from the Vandals, who were crossing into Africa, Rome's breadbasket, and without Constantius's steady hand, the Western Empire would stumble ever closer toward its final collapse. The Vandals and the struggle for Africa. Count Boniface's last stand. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had stabilized, at least for a fleeting moment, under the firm hand of Constantius III. But his sudden death in 421 unraveled the fragile order he had created. Within a decade, Rome faced one of its greatest disasters, the loss of North Africa, its richest province and lifeline of grain. This crisis came not from within the Italian heartland, nor from the Visigoths who still roamed Gaul and Hispania, but from across the Mediterranean. There, the Vandals, a once wandering Germanic tribe, rose to power under their ruthless and brilliant king, Gaiseric. Their advance into Africa would set the Western Empire on an irreversible path to ruin. Africa, the jewel of the West. Africa Proconsularis, centered on Carthage, was no ordinary province. It was Rome's breadbasket. For centuries, fleets of grain ships had sailed north across the Mediterranean, feeding the teeming population of Italy. Whoever controlled Africa controlled the food supply, and with it, the survival of the empire itself. Losing Africa was unthinkable. And yet, by the 420s, cracks were already forming. The Vandals had been wandering for decades, first in Gaul, then crossing the Pyrenees into Hispania. There, they fought bitter wars with both Romans and rival tribes. Driven by famine, pressure from other Germanic peoples, and the promise of fertile land, they turned their gaze south. Enter Count Boniface. Rome's last line of defense in Africa was Count Boniface, one of the most capable Roman generals of his age. Boniface had risen through the ranks during the days of Constantius III, proving himself a skilled commander and loyal servant of the empire. He governed Africa with firmness and fairness, earning the respect of soldiers and civilians alike. But like so many Roman generals of the time, Boniface was soon entangled in the poisonous intrigues of the imperial court. At the palace in Ravenna, the Empress Galla Placidia, widow of Constantius III and regent for her young son Valentinian III, was locked in a deadly rivalry with the general Flavius Aetius, the ambitious Magister Militum. Aetius, seeking to eliminate Boniface as a rival, spread rumors that the count was plotting rebellion. Placidia, deceived, recalled Boniface to Italy under suspicion. Warned that this was a trap, Boniface refused. Branded a traitor, he now stood isolated. It was at this moment of peril that he made a fateful decision, one that would change the empire forever. The Vandals' cross to Africa. To strengthen his hand against Ravenna, Boniface invited the Vandals into Africa as allies, perhaps thinking he could control them. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. In 429 AD, Gaiseric led some 80,000 Vandals and Alans across the Strait of Gibraltar into Roman Africa. Once there, it became clear that they were not allies, but conquerors. The Vandals swept across the countryside, looting estates, burning villages, and enslaving thousands. Boniface, realizing too late the enormity of his error, tried to resist. In 430 AD, he gathered his forces at Hippo Regius, a fortified city on the coast of modern Algeria. Inside its walls was none other than St. Augustine, the bishop of Hippo and one of the greatest theologians of Christianity. As the Vandals laid siege, Augustine, now in his 70s, watched his city crumble around him. He died during the siege, his last days marked by the sound of barbarian war drums outside the walls. The fall of Hippo sent shock waves throughout the empire. Boniface fought valiantly, but his armies were too few, his position too isolated. Carthage itself was now in danger. Civil war in the West. As Africa burned, the court in Ravenna descended further into intrigue. Placidia, realizing she had been deceived, recalled Boniface and restored him to favor. But reconciliation came too late. In 432 AD, Boniface and Aetius clashed in open battle in Italy. It was a tragic conflict, Rome's two greatest generals fighting each other while Gaiseric tightened his grip on Africa. Boniface won the battle, but was mortally wounded. He died soon after, leaving the empire weaker than ever. Aetius, though defeated, would rise again, eventually becoming Rome's last great general. But for Africa, Boniface's death was the end. The rise of the Vandal kingdom. By 439 AD, Gaiseric captured Carthage itself. With its fall, Rome lost not just a city, but the foundation of its survival. Grain shipments ceased. The Western Empire, already fragile, was now economically crippled. The Vandals established a new kingdom in Africa, ruling from Carthage, with fleets that soon dominated the Western Mediterranean. They became pirates and raiders, striking Sicily, Sardinia, and even Italy itself. No longer wandering tribes, they were now a settled power, and one of Rome's most dangerous enemies. The legacy of Boniface, Count Boniface, was remembered as a tragic figure, brave, loyal, and capable, but ensnared by court intrigue and undone by a single fatal mistake. The historian Procopius, writing a century later, called him the last of the Romans for his valiant defense of Africa. But history is not always kind. Boniface's miscalculation had handed Rome's most vital province to its enemies. The Vandals would hold Africa for nearly a century, their power unchecked until the great reconquests of Justinian in the 6th century. For the Western Empire, however, the damage was permanent. Without Africa's grain, Rome could never again sustain its armies or its people. It was a wound from which the West would never recover. The loss of Africa was a turning point. Yet even as the Vandals tightened their grip on the Mediterranean, a new figure emerged in Italy, a general who, like Stilicho before him, would hold back the tide of chaos with sheer willpower. His name was Flavius Aetius, and he would go down in history as Rome's last great general. Flavius Aetius and the battle against Attila the Hun. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was battered, divided, and bleeding out. The Visigoths ruled in Gaul, the Vandals had seized Africa, and countless smaller tribes carved out pieces of Roman land. Yet even in this age of decline, the empire produced one final towering figure, Flavius Aetius, remembered by many as the last of the Romans. Aetius was not just a soldier. He was a diplomat, a survivor, and above all, a man who understood the brutal new world that Rome now lived in, a world dominated by Germanic kings and the shadow of a far more terrifying power, the Huns. The rise of Aetius. Aetius was born around 396 AD in Durostorum, modern-day Bulgaria, to a Roman officer of Scythian origin. Unlike most Roman aristocrats, Aetius spent part of his youth not in the courts of Ravenna or Constantinople, but among the so-called barbarians. As a hostage first to the Visigoths and later to the Huns, Aetius grew up immersed in the culture of Rome's fiercest enemies. He learned their languages, mastered horseback archery, and understood their way of war. By the time he returned to Roman service, Aetius was uniquely equipped to deal with these dangerous neighbors. This early exposure would define his career. Where others saw the barbarians as uncivilized invaders, Aetius saw them as potential allies, weapons to be wielded in Rome's defense, a world on fire. The empire Aetius inherited was crumbling. Africa was lost to the Vandals. Gaul was fractured between Romans, Visigoths, Burgundians, and Franks. Hispania was a patchwork of Suebi and Gothic settlements. Italy itself was unstable, plagued by weak emperors and constant intrigue. But Aetius rose steadily through the ranks, using both his military skill and his web of barbarian alliances. By 433, he was appointed Magister Militum, commander-in-chief of the Western armies. For nearly 2 decades, he would be the true ruler of the West, the last man capable of holding the empire together. The coming of Attila. In the 440s, a new storm swept across Europe, the rise of the Huns under Attila. The Huns were no longer just raiders. Under Attila's ruthless leadership, they became a confederation of warriors numbering in the hundreds of thousands, demanding tribute from both East and West. Entire nations, Goths, Gepids, Siri, Rugians, were pressed into Hun service. The Eastern Empire paid enormous sums of gold just to keep them at bay. For Rome, Attila was an existential threat. In 451, the storm finally broke. Attila crossed the Rhine with an army that may have numbered 100,000 men, plundering cities across Gaul. Paris and Orleans seemed doomed. The Western Empire faced annihilation. The alliance of enemies. Aetius understood that Rome alone could not defeat Attila. He needed allies, even former enemies. With remarkable diplomacy, he forged an unprecedented coalition. The Visigoths under King Theodoric V, the Burgundians, the Franks, and remnants of the Roman legions. Together, this unlikely alliance confronted Attila on the plains of Gaul. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, 451 AD. On the fields near modern-day Chalon, the fate of Western Europe was decided. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, also known as the Battle of Chalon, was one of the last great clashes of antiquity. The fighting was savage and chaotic. The Visigothic king Theodoric fell in battle, trampled by his own men. The Huns, with their terrifying cavalry, nearly broke the Roman line. But Aetius, commanding with iron resolve, held firm. By nightfall, Attila's army was in retreat. The Huns had suffered a defeat they would never forget. Europe had been saved, for now. Aetius the peacemaker. Aetius did not pursue Attila to the death. Instead, he allowed the Huns to withdraw. Some later accused him of weakness, even treachery. But Aetius knew the truth. Rome lacked the strength to destroy the Huns outright. His coalition was fragile, and pressing too far might have shattered it. By preserving balance, he ensured Rome's survival for a few more years. In 452, Attila invaded Italy itself, ravaging the Po Valley. But famine, disease, and diplomacy, including a legendary embassy from Pope Leo I, forced him to withdraw. A year later, Attila was dead, and the Hun Empire soon collapsed into civil war. Rome had weathered the storm thanks to Aetius. The tragic end of Aetius. Yet, like Stilicho before him, Aetius would not be rewarded for his service. By the mid-450s, he was the most powerful man in the West, too powerful for the weak Emperor Valentinian III. In 454, during a court audience in Ravenna, Valentinian drew his sword and struck Aetius down with his own hands. The man who had saved Rome from Attila was murdered by the very emperor he had served. A courtier is said to have remarked, "You have cut off your right hand with your left." The prophecy proved true. Within a year, Valentinian himself was assassinated by Aetius's former bodyguards. With his death, the Western Empire plunged into chaos from which it would never recover. Legacy of the last great Roman Flavius Aetius has often been called the last of the Romans. He was the final general who could still command both Romans and barbarians, the last to win a major victory that saved Western Europe from conquest. But his death left a vacuum no one could fill. The Vandals soon sacked Rome itself in 455. Provinces fell away one by one. The empire stumbled toward its inevitable end. Yet in the story of Aetius, we see Rome's last flash of brilliance, the courage, diplomacy, and resilience that had built an empire, now burning brightly one final time before the long night of collapse. Majorian, the last hope of the Western Empire. When Flavius Aetius was struck down in 454, the Western Roman Empire lost its shield. Within a year, Emperor Valentinian III was also dead, murdered by Aetius's former guards. The empire entered a deadly spiral of intrigue, assassinations, and puppet rulers controlled by powerful generals. Amid this chaos, one man rose above the rest, not merely a soldier, but a visionary. Flavius Julius Valerius Majorianus, remembered simply as Majorian, would become the last Western emperor who truly tried to restore Rome's former glory. The world after Aetius. The years after Aetius's death were catastrophic. In 455, the Vandal king Gaiseric sailed from Carthage with his fleet and sacked Rome. For 2 weeks, the Eternal City was plundered of its treasures, its people enslaved. The once proud capital was humiliated, a symbol of Rome's helplessness. Meanwhile, barbarian kingdoms spread unchecked across the empire's former provinces. The Visigoths tightened their hold on Gaul and Hispania. The Burgundians carved out their own kingdom in the Rhone Valley. The Suebi entrenched themselves in northwestern Spain. And the Vandals, masters of the seas, dominated the western Mediterranean. By the late 450s, the Western Roman Empire had been reduced to Italy and fragments of Gaul. It seemed only a matter of time before the empire vanished completely. The rise of Majorian. Into this bleak world stepped Majorian, born around 420 into a family of Roman officers. He served under Aetius in Gaul, earning a reputation as a courageous and disciplined commander. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he was respected by both Roman troops and barbarian allies. By 457, after a series of palace coups and assassinations, Majorian was proclaimed emperor by his soldiers. Unlike the shadowy puppet emperors before him, Majorian took the throne with a clear mission: to restore the empire, both militarily and morally. Reforming the army and the state, Majorian understood that Rome's decline was not just military, it was political, social, and moral. He set out to reform the empire from within. He restored discipline in the army, purging corrupt officers and rewarding merit over birth. He revised the tax system, cracking down on abuses by wealthy elites who avoided their dues. He protected common citizens, passing laws against the exploitation of peasants and strengthening property rights. He even issued decrees to preserve Roman monuments, forbidding the looting of ancient buildings for stone. For the first time in decades, the West had an emperor who acted not as a caretaker, but as a true leader. Campaigns in Gaul and Hispania. Majorian's reforms were matched by bold military campaigns. In Gaul, he defeated the Visigoths under King Theodoric II, forcing them back into a federate alliance with Rome. The Burgundians and Franks were also compelled to respect his authority. He then turned his gaze to Hispania, where the Suebi had expanded unchecked for decades. In a lightning campaign, Majorian crushed the Suebi army near modern-day Lugo, restoring Roman control over much of Spain. These victories brought hope. For the first time in years, it seemed possible that Rome might recover. The Grand Plan: Reconquest of Africa. Majorian knew that to truly revive the empire, Africa had to be retaken from the Vandals. Without its grain, Italy would always starve. Without its wealth, the empire would always be weak. In 460 AD, he began assembling the largest Roman fleet in a century, over 300 ships, stationed at Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena. His goal was nothing less than the reconquest of North Africa. But Gaiseric, the cunning Vandal king, struck first. Through spies and sabotage, the Vandals managed to destroy Majorian's fleet before it ever set sail. The dream of reclaiming Africa was lost in flames. The fall of Majorian. Even in failure, Majorian did not give up. He returned to Italy to regroup and continue his reforms. But his success and popularity had earned him dangerous enemies, chief among them the powerful General Ricimer, a Germanic warlord who was the true kingmaker of the West. Ricimer feared Majorian's independence and vision. In 461 AD, while Majorian was traveling through northern Italy, Ricimer seized him. The emperor was deposed, stripped of his imperial regalia, and brutally executed near Tortona. He was only about 40 years old. The last hope Majorian's reign had lasted just 4 years, but in that time he had achieved more than any Western emperor in decades. He had reformed the state, won victories in Gaul and Spain, and dared to dream of reconquest. The historian Edward Gibbon would later call him the last great emperor of the West. Others have remembered him as a tragic figure, the man who might have saved the empire if only he had been given more time. With Majorian's death, the Western Empire lost its last true chance at revival. What followed was a string of weak puppet emperors, controlled by Ricimer and his successors, as the empire staggered toward its final collapse. Majorian's legacy. Majorian was not just a soldier. He was a reformer, a statesman, and perhaps the last Roman ruler who still embodied the old ideals of discipline, justice, and civic duty. His life proved that even in the empire's dying days, there were still men who dreamed of Rome's greatness. But dreams alone could not stop the tide of history. With Majorian gone, the West's light flickered and dimmed, leaving only shadows of what had once been the greatest empire on earth. Anthemius, the emperor, from the east. By the 460s, The Western Roman Empire was no longer an empire in the traditional sense. Its frontiers had disintegrated, its provinces stripped away by barbarian kingdoms, and its emperors were little more than pawns controlled by powerful generals like Ricimer. Italy, some parts of Gaul, and fragments of Hispania were all that remained. Yet, for one brief moment, there was hope. That hope came not from Italy, but from the Eastern Empire, still thriving under the rule of Leo Thak in Constantinople. Determined to prevent the total collapse of the West, Leo sent a seasoned statesman and general to rule in his name. His name was Anthemius. The arrival of Anthemius. Anthemius was no ordinary appointee. Born into a noble family around 420 AD, he was the grandson of one of Theodosius the Great's top generals. He had been educated in both military strategy and statesmanship. By the 460s, he had already proven his ability as a commander against the Huns and had a reputation for integrity. In 467 AD, Emperor Leo crowned Anthemius as Western Emperor and dispatched him to Italy. For the first time in decades, the West had an emperor of stature, not a weak puppet or a warlord's tool. When Anthemius arrived in Ravenna, the western capital, he brought with him not just his authority, but also the promise of unity. The East and West would cooperate to crush the Vandals and reclaim Africa, Rome's lost breadbasket. A grand vision of restoration. Anthemius understood that saving the empire required bold action. Like Majorian before him, he knew that Africa was the key. The Vandals, under King Gaiseric, were masters of the seas, launching raids across Italy and the Mediterranean. If Africa could be retaken, the West might once again have the resources to survive. With Leo's support, Anthemius and the East organized one of the largest campaigns of the century. In 468, a colossal fleet, over 1,000 ships, manned by more than 100,000 men, set sail against the Vandals. It was one of the greatest military undertakings of late antiquity, but disaster struck. Poor leadership, miscommunication, and Gaiseric's cunning doomed the expedition. At the Battle of Cape Bon, the Roman fleet was burned and shattered. Tens of thousands of men died. The cost was staggering, bankrupting both East and West. It was the last time Rome would ever attempt such a massive operation. Anthemius in Gaul. Though the African dream was gone, Anthemius did not give up. He turned his attention to Gaul, where the Visigoths were growing more powerful under King Euric. From his base in Arles, Anthemius attempted to rally what Roman forces remained, working with allies such as Syagrius, the last Roman commander in northern Gaul. But the campaigns in Gaul met only limited success. The Visigoths were too strong, and the Western army too fractured. Tensions in Italy. As Anthemius struggled abroad, trouble was brewing at home. His relationship with Ricimer, the Germanic general who held real power in Italy, quickly soured. Anthemius represented the Eastern vision of reform and restoration, while Ricimer wanted only a compliant figurehead. By 472, their rivalry exploded into open conflict. Ricimer marched on Rome itself, laying siege to the Eternal City. Famine and plague broke out within the walls. For months, Anthemius resisted, refusing to surrender. Eventually, the city was betrayed from within. Anthemius was captured by Ricimer's forces, dragged through the streets of Rome, and brutally executed. The last emperor of Promise Anthemius's reign had lasted just 5 years, but he was the last Western emperor who truly tried to restore the empire. Unlike the puppets who followed, he fought for more than survival. He fought for revival. His failure was not due to weakness, but to bad fortune, treachery, and the sheer impossibility of the task. The Vandals could not be destroyed, the Visigoths could not be contained, and Ricimer's ambitions poisoned Italy from within. Legacy of Anthemius historians have often overlooked Anthemius, dismissing him as just another doomed ruler. Yet in reality, he was one of the last men to embody the old Roman spirit. He was a reformer who tried to stabilize the West. He was a warrior who stood against both barbarians and usurpers. He was a martyr for the empire, dying in the streets of Rome rather than abandoning his duty. Some later writers would call him the Greek on the Western throne. But this label ignores the truth. Anthemius fought and died as a Roman. With his death in 472, the Western Empire entered its final death throes. Only shadows remained, weak puppet emperors with no authority, clinging to a name that no longer carried power. The end was inevitable now, and it was coming soon. The final collapse. Romulus Augustulus and the fall of the West by the 470s, the Western Roman Empire was little more than a hollow shell. The vast dominions that had once stretched from Britain to North Africa had been carved away by barbarian kings. Italy remained the heart of the empire, but even there, emperors were shadows, controlled by generals and Germanic warlords. The death of Anthemius in 472 marked the last serious attempt to revive the West. After his fall, the empire slipped into chaos. Ricimer, the puppet master of Italy, died the same year. In the power vacuum that followed, the West staggered from one short-lived ruler to another, each weaker than the last. And so, the empire that had once ruled the known world limped toward its end. The rise of Orestes. In 475 AD, a man named Orestes seized power in Italy. Once a secretary to Attila the Hun, Orestes had risen through the ranks of Roman politics and military affairs. He commanded the loyalty of both Roman troops and barbarian mercenaries. When the sitting emperor Julius Nepos failed to keep control, Orestes drove him out of Italy. Nepos fled to Dalmatia, where he would linger in exile. In his place, Orestes installed his teenage son on the throne. The boy's name was Romulus, but history would remember him by the diminutive Romulus Augustulus, the little Augustus. It was an ironic name combining the first emperor of Rome, Augustus, with its last. At only about 15 years old, Romulus was a puppet ruler, a symbol with no real power. The empire was now nothing more than a facade. The demand of the mercenaries. Orestes' rule, however, was short-lived. The barbarian mercenaries who formed the backbone of the army had grown restless. They demanded land in Italy as payment for their service, lands to settle their families permanently. Orestes refused. To grant such lands would mean carving up the last Roman provinces, effectively surrendering Italy to barbarian control. His refusal sealed his fate. The rise of Odoacer. Among the mercenaries was a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, leader of a coalition of Heruli, Syri, and other tribes. Charismatic and ambitious, Odoacer seized the moment. In 476 AD, his troops mutinied. Orestes was captured and executed. Odoacer marched on Ravenna, the imperial capital, and confronted the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus. The fall of Romulus Augustulus. What happened next was unlike the violent overthrows of earlier emperors. Odoacer, perhaps moved by the boy's youth and helplessness, spared Romulus's life. Instead of execution, Romulus was sent into exile on a villa in Campania, granted a pension to live out his days in obscurity. It was a quiet end for the last emperor of the West. No grand battle, no dramatic death on the field, just the extinguishing of a title that had once commanded the world. The end of the Western Roman Empire. After deposing Romulus, Odoacer sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple robe, the imperial insignia, to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. His message was simple. There is no need for two emperors. One is enough. The West no longer requires its own Augustus. With that symbolic act, the Western Roman Empire was officially dissolved. The Senate in Italy pledged loyalty to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, and Odoacer declared himself King of Italy, ruling in Zeno's name. Though Romans continued to live in Italy, their empire was gone. What remained was a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms, built atop Roman ruins. Was 476 truly the end? Historians have debated whether 476 AD truly marks the fall of Rome. After all, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, would continue for nearly another 1,000 years until 1453. Roman law, Roman culture, and Roman identity persisted long after Romulus Augustulus was gone. Yet the deposition of Romulus symbolized something greater: the end of Roman rule in the West, the collapse of the political entity that had once united Europe, North Africa, and the Near East under a single banner. The legacy of the last emperor. Romulus Augustulus himself fades into the mists of history. We know nothing of his later life. Some suggest he may have lived quietly into old age on his villa, watching as the world around him transformed into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms. His name, Romulus Augustus, seemed chosen by fate. The first Roman king, Romulus, had founded the city. The first Roman emperor, Augustus, had built the empire. And now Romulus Augustulus, the little Augustus, closed the book on the Western Roman Empire forever. The final curtain, the fall of Romulus Augustulus, was not just the end of an emperor. It was the end of an age, the death of the ancient world, and the birth of medieval Europe. The Western Roman Empire had lasted for more than 5 centuries, shaping the destiny of continents. Its fall left a vacuum that would be filled by new powers: the Franks, the Goths, the Vandals, and eventually the rising force of Byzantium. But the memory of Rome never truly died. In law, in language, in architecture, and in dreams of empire, the legacy of Rome endured. As the chronicler later wrote, "Rome fell, but Rome never truly died." The legacy of Rome. An empire without end. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 AD marked the official end of the Western Roman Empire. Yet in reality, the story of Rome did not end. The emperors may have fallen, the legions may have disbanded, but the idea of Rome, its culture, laws, and legacy, endured for centuries, shaping the world that followed. Rome, even in death, remained immortal. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium. While the West collapsed, the Eastern Roman Empire survived. From its capital at Constantinople, the East, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, remained a powerful, sophisticated state. Its emperors saw themselves as the rightful heirs of Augustus and Trajan. Byzantium preserved Roman law through Justinian's code, safeguarded classical Greek knowledge, and kept alive the structures of empire long after the West was gone. For nearly 1,000 years after Romulus Augustulus vanished into obscurity, Eastern Roman emperors ruled, until the final fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD. In that sense, the Roman Empire outlasted its western half by almost a millennium. The Church, Rome's spiritual empire. As the empire's political power crumbled, the Christian Church rose to take its place. Bishops, and above all the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, became the new moral and spiritual leaders of the former empire. Pope Gregory the Great, ruling at the end of the 6th century, consciously embraced the Roman heritage, calling himself the protector of the city and the inheritor of its mission. The Church carried forward Roman organization, Latin language, and Roman law into the Middle Ages. Even as barbarian kings ruled Europe, they did so under the shadow of Roman Christianity. In many ways, the Roman Empire lived on in the Church. Barbarian kingdoms, the new Rome. The very tribes that had destroyed Rome also preserved parts of it. The Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, and the Franks in Gaul adopted Roman customs, titles, and laws. Clovis, the Frankish king who defeated Syagrius, styled himself a Roman ruler. His descendants, the Merovingians and later the Carolingians, continued to see themselves not as destroyers of Rome, but as its successors. The Vandals minted coins in Roman style. The Visigoths kept Roman law courts. Even Odoacer, the man who deposed Romulus Augustulus, sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, acknowledging that Rome still lived, if only in the East. the Holy Roman Empire. In the year 800 AD, nearly 325 years after the fall of the West, a Frankish king named Charlemagne knelt in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. It was a deliberate revival of the imperial title. Though historians call it the Holy Roman Empire, it was a new institution, Germanic in blood, Christian in faith, but Roman in ambition. For centuries, European kings and emperors claimed they were heirs to Rome. Even Napoleon in the 19th century compared himself to Caesar. The shadow of Rome stretched across ages, Roman law, language, and legacy. Perhaps Rome's greatest legacy was not its armies, but its ideas. Roman law became the foundation of legal systems across Europe. Concepts like contracts, property rights, and citizenship endure to this day. The Latin language evolved into the Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, and influenced English and German. Architecture and engineering, arches, aqueducts, domes, and roads remained the blueprint for European civilization. Even the calendar we use today is a Roman invention, refined under Julius Caesar and Augustus. The dream of Rome, oh. For centuries after its fall, Rome remained the ultimate symbol of power. To call oneself Caesar was to claim legitimacy. The Russian czars, the German kaisers, both titles derived directly from Caesar. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the Russians proclaimed Moscow the Third Rome. To be Roman was no longer about blood or geography. It was about carrying forward the legacy of empire, order, and civilization. The last Roman who, then, was the last Roman? Was it Romulus Augustulus, the final boy emperor of the West? Was it Julius Nepos, still clinging to power in Dalmatia? Was it the general Belisarius, fighting to reclaim lost lands? Or Constantine V, the last emperor of Constantinople, who died sword in hand on the city walls in 1453? In truth, there was no single last Roman. Rome lived on in many forms, in Byzantium, in the papacy, in the kingdoms of Europe, and in the hearts of men who dreamed of empire, an empire without end. Rome may have fallen in 476 AD, but its story never ended. Its culture, laws, religion, and memory continued to shape the world for centuries. From Washington, D.C. to Moscow, from Paris to Istanbul, echoes of Rome still surround us. As the poet once said, Rome is not in Rome, but wherever her laws and her power endure. The empire is gone, but the idea of Rome, eternal, unbroken, and immortal, lives on. The final Eastern Romans. For nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the West in 476, the Eastern Roman Empire endured. Known today as Byzantium, its emperors never called themselves anything but Romans. They ruled from Constantinople, guarded by walls that seemed unbreachable, their banners still bearing the double-headed eagle. But by the 15th century, their empire was reduced to a fragile shadow. A few provinces, a few cities, and finally only Constantinople itself. The last emperor of Constantinople, 1453. On May 29, 1453, the cannons of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II thundered against the battered walls of Constantinople. For 53 days the defenders had resisted, hopelessly outnumbered, but fiercely determined. At their head stood Emperor Constantine the Thiccan Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor. He wore no crown in his final hours. Casting aside the trappings of power, he fought as a soldier among his men. As the Ottomans surged into the city, Constantine reportedly cried, "The city has fallen, but I am still alive." He charged into the fray and vanished. His body was never found. Some say he was buried anonymously by his enemies. Others whisper he will one day return, a marble emperor awakening to reclaim his throne. In him, the spirit of Rome died as it had lived, sword in hand, unyielding to the very last. David of Trebizond, the emperor in exile, 1461. Yet the Roman story did not end with Constantine. In the far east of the Black Sea, the Empire of Trebizond, founded after the Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, still held out. Its capital, Trebizond, clung to the cliffs above the sea, a last beacon of the Roman name. Its final ruler, David Komnenos, styled himself emperor and continued the ceremonies of Rome. But in 1461, 8 years after Constantinople's fall, Mehmed II turned his gaze eastward. Surrounded, Trebizond surrendered. David was taken to Constantinople, where he and his sons were executed. With his death, another Roman flame was extinguished. Leonardo of Epirus, the last despot, 1479. Even then, a final ember smoldered. In Epirus, in western Greece, the small despotate of Epirus, a Byzantine successor state, struggled on. Its last ruler, Leonardo III Tocco, held the fortress of Vonitsa. By 1479, Ottoman power was irresistible. Leonardo fled into exile, his lands absorbed into the Sultan's domains. With him fell the last remnant of the Byzantine world. From Augustus to Constantine V, from Romulus Augustulus to David of Trebizond, from emperors to exiled despots, the Roman line was finished. Or was it? Were there many last Romans? So who was truly the last Roman? Was it Romulus Augustulus in 476, fading into obscurity in Italy? Was it Constantine V, dying on the walls of Constantinople in 1453? Was it David of Trebizond? Or Leonardo of Epirus, executed and exiled in the empire's twilight? Or perhaps there was never a single last Roman at all? The idea of Rome did not die with any one man. It lived on in the Holy Roman Empire, where emperors from Charlemagne to the Habsburgs styled themselves as heirs of Caesar. It lived on in Russia, where czars called Moscow the Third Rome. It lived on in the laws, languages, and architecture of Europe. And in truth, it lives on even today. Every time we speak in languages descended from Latin, every time we walk roads first laid by Roman engineers, every time we debate laws founded on Roman principles, we carry Rome with us. Rome was not just a place, it was an idea, and ideas do not fall to armies. In truth, there were many last Romans, and perhaps in some way we are all heirs of Rome.